Hi, in today's video we're going to be installing a new suspension fork to a mountain bike. Now for this process I'm going to run you through everything. That involves how to measure and trim down the steerer tube accurately and safely, installing a staff angled nut in the top, and of course actually getting the fork on the bike nice and safely. Now it's a pretty simple process and any of you can do this at home with just a few simple tools. Okay, so for this job you're going to need a number of tools. Okay, so you're going to need the relevant Allen keys to fit your particular fork and controls on a bike. You'll be needing to remove and adjust the top cap, your stem, and of course the hose mount on your fork. You might also need a 6mm Allen key if your suspension fork has any sort of bolt through axle on there. Next up, you're going to need some kind of method for installing the star nut. Now, you can't really beat the traditional tools for this. There's a couple of different styles on the market, but you can get away with using an M5 bolt. I'll teach you how to do that in this video. You're going to need a mallet. Rubber-ended mallet or a soft-ended mallet is good. You're going to need a file of some description. This one's a metal file with a rounded edge, the profile on it. You need that for the inside of the steerer tube itself. A hacksaw is the best practice along with a saw guide of some kind, but you can also do this using an actual pipe cutter. Now, something to say about pipe cutters is you mustn't over tighten them when you're cutting something like a steerer tube, and it must have a sharp disc on there. Otherwise you can risk very slightly flaring out the end of the actual steerer tube there. And it'll be a minute amount, but it will make installing a stem difficult, and it will require quite a bit of filing away to correct it afterwards. So just something to take care with. The last thing, of course, is some good grease. Your preference in grease to suit the headset on your bike. And one last thing actually, it's non-essential, but it's a really good idea to use a torque wrench when you're securing your stem and your controls back onto that steering tube of the bike to make sure it is a safe torque there. I'll talk to you a little bit about these when we get there. Okay, so step one then is to remove your old fork from the bike. So if you have a work stand, get your bike in a work stand, get that front wheel out. It could be a quick release, could be a QR15, it could be a bolt through. Whatever method, remove your front wheel. Now before you go any further, I can't recommend doing this stage enough. Get yourself a bit of flat cardboard or a pad spacer if you have one preferably, and wedge it in between those brake pads, because at some point you'll probably accidentally pull your front brake, which will mean of course your pads will close together and it means more faffing around later. Get a pad spacer in there first to stop that happening. And then you want to remove the caliper from the actual base of the fork down the bottom there using a 5mm Allen key, and then remove the hose guide as well. Now the sizing on this depends on what model of fork you have. Just take care it's a very small Allen bolt on there, you don't want to damage that. Next up, you want to loosen off your stem clamp bolts and the top cap bolt on there. So on this bike is two 4mm bolts and a 5 as the top. Yours could have 4, 5 or 6mm here. So just have a little check first, make sure you've got everything you need to do this. Now just one thing to add, if you're doing this on a Canyon or any other bike that has like a knock block or anything similar on the top here, this will actually stop the fork falling out. It's basically essentially a stop. So I'm actually going to loosen this as well. Just have a look to see if your bike has that feature, but most bikes don't. Now take caution here, loosen the stem clamp bolts first and then loosen your top cap bolt last. But when you loosen this top cap bolt, make sure that you're holding the fork, because sometimes the fork can literally just slide out at this part of the process. Other times you need to manually manipulate the stem to get it off that steerer tube. Now just take your time here, remove very carefully, let the fork slide out, and taking care that any of the headset components don't drop on the floor. Now ideally what you want to do here is lay your headset components down in order on a bit of shop towel or something like that on your workbench so you can keep an eye on them. And you're also going to clean these, re-grease these when you put these back in as well. So it's important to make sure they're in the correct order. Now it's perfectly acceptable to just let your handlebars, your controls, just dangle slightly at this stage. Now if by chance you had another fork or a steerer tube laying around the place, you could insert this in here to hold everything in place, but we're going to base this on people doing this at home, so you may not have that. So just take care, let everything dangle down, and then it's over to the workbench. Okay, with the fork out the bike, you still need to remove the crown race on here. That is this little thing that sits into the bearing that's in your frame. Now there's two major styles of these. There's ones that are pressed on, and there's ones like this one actually, which gives me a get out of jail clause here. There's actually a split ring. Now the split ring ones are really simple to remove. You literally, with something very delicate, just prise them a bit until it comes off that taper, and then you'll be able to remove it by hand from the fork itself. So no tools needed for those. They're very common these days. However, if you have the other type, then you're in a bit of a predicament here. There's two ways of removing these. There's the correct way, which involves using a massive tool. In fact, I'm going to throw myself on screen right here using the correct tool for the job. But this is a pro workshop tool, and I'm fully aware, not what you will have at home. Now, it leaves you with two methods for removing the crown race here. So the correct version, of course, is by using the tool. There's another way you can do it, and it's by using a punch or a flat screwdriver. It's not a recommended way of doing it, to be fair, and you can damage your fork and you can damage that lower crown race. I have done this many times, removed it, not damaged my crown race, that is. And if you're going to do it, just be very careful. So you want an old flat screwdriver, one that you don't use for other things. You don't want to use a flat screwdriver that you use on other parts of the bike, for example. And in this little recess here, you can just use it to just punch it loose. All you need to do is just remove the first little bit, and then you'll find as soon as it hits that taper, just like the split ring does, you're able to remove it. However, you should take extreme care if you're going to go down this method. And if you have a carbon steer tube or a carbon crown on your fork, avoid it at all costs. So if you need to remove a crown race that's a single piece design and you've got something delicate and you're not sure about it, go to your bike shop for this step. They will remove that for you, and if you're lucky, they will install the new one for you as well. Now's the time to measure up your new steer tube, and you've got a couple of ways of doing this. Now, the first one is by referencing the fork you took off your bike. If you had enough stem spaces under or on top of your stem and you're happy with that position, then you can go like for like. That's exactly what I'm going to do here. Now, all you would do simply is measure from the crown with no crown race on to the very top of that steer tube, and that is the measurement that you'll need to mark on the new steer tube. So in this case, this one is 21 centimeters or 210 millimeters exactly. So that's the measurement I'm going to make on the new one. However, there is another method. So let's just say you've got a frame and you're fitting a new fork to it, and this isn't part of your process. And the way to do this would be to install the crown race and do a dry installation, which means basically putting the fork in place, putting your required amount of stem spacers on, and then making a marking at the top. You make this marking, and then of course you want to subtract between 3 and 4 millimeters off that, and that will be your cut mark. Now again, I'm just going to refer back to when I took the fork off and I took that top cap off. Look at this on screen and you'll see the recess here where the top of the steer tube is just recessed below the clamp of the stem there. Now this is optimum, and the reason for this is there's always going to be some sort of movement in the system, and you're basically taking up that play when you're basically adjusting it to make sure there's no movement in the headset. It's not adjusting the bearings like it would have done with regular cup and cone bearings back in the day. You're using cartridge bearings here, they're non-adjustable, but you are making sure there's no movement in the system, no play, and then you secure your clamp to keep it tight. So it is important to leave that amount of room at the top there. So that is why you'll make your marking at the top of the steer tube or wherever it is you want it, and then enable that little space by making your cut mark very slightly lower. Okay, at this point, I'm going to double, triple, quadruple check everything here, measurements before I cut my steer tube. Okay, so I've got my mark on here. You just got to check this so many times, okay? Right, so it's 214. Right, I know I want it at 210, okay? Or, yeah, so that's exactly where I'm going to make that mark right now. So I'm happy with that. I've measured in the frame and I've measured against the old fork steer tube. So that is 210 right there. Now I'm just going to measure that mark just to be sure. Yep, I'm satisfied with that. I'm just going to make a very clear mark. Now, something very important to say again, just before you cut, make sure there's only one mark in the place you're going to make the cut. You don't want to be confused and cut on just a random scuff on the steer tube that's occurred from, I don't know, transit, or if you bought a second-hand fork or whatever. Make sure you check before you cut. So I'm just going to make my last mark here. There's your one last time. There we go. Right, so that is my cut mark. Now at this point, there's a couple of options available to you. Like I said, you can use a pipe cutter. I've done this before in other videos and I love using these. This one has a fresh blade, so I know it's safe to use. And you never need to overly tighten them. The whole idea is you tighten it sufficiently and you just keep scoring until you get through. If you over tighten it, you run the risk of very slightly flaring that tube, which will need more work with the file afterwards. So today we're going to be using good old faithful hacksaw and a saw guide. This is by far the most accurate way of doing it. Of course, you can make your own guide. You could do it by eye. You might not ever get a completely straight cut though. Okay, so now it's time to get my saw guide and get it into the vise. I'm going to swivel my vise around and make sure the worktop is all nice and clear. You don't want to get any metal filings and any bits of metal swarf and stuff in any working parts, okay? So now let's get the fork in and let's get this lined up with everything as required. Okay, so we have our fork mounted in the saw guide. The vise is nice and sturdy and there's nothing around for those metal filings or metal swarf stuff to get anywhere near. So nice, smooth action with the saw. You're not in a hurry here, you want a nice clean cut. Keep going until you're all the way through. Don't be tempted to just snap the end of the steer tube off when you're nearly there. Cut all the way through, and if you need to, support the end of the steer tube there as well. Now with a good cut in place, what I like to do is get to work with the file on there and make sure the end of the tube is really, really smooth. Now, a little bit of advice, be careful how you do this because you don't want any of those metal filings to drop around your fork seals or anywhere like that because you're not going to notice them all, and as the fork telescopes, as it's under its action, under compression, it will naturally sort of ingest that into the fork, and that is not good. It'll scratch up your nice new fork. So emphasize the fact, make sure they're clean before you put them on your bike. But what I like to do is just loosen from the saw guide and using the clamp of the saw guide to hold the fork in place. Given the fact there's loads of swarf and filings and bits of metal basically around here, I'll make more in this place. So this is easier for me to clean up and it's not going to have any chance of getting near those fork seals. So I'm just going to work my way around. And you're aiming to get a finish that's smooth enough that there's no noticeable edge that you can feel with your thumb. Okay, so with a nice smooth finished steerer tube there, all prepped, ready to go on a bike. Next step is to get the star nut on the inside. Now the star nut is what's used to essentially pull everything together and compress it. So if you look at the one on the inside of the steerer tube of the old fork, you can see one that's mounted and you can see this one that doesn't have one in place. Now the correct tool is a star nut setting tool. There's various different options. I've got this one, which is a Park TNS1. It's quite an old one. You essentially screw the nut in place and hammer it in. It basically sits flush when it's in the correct place and you remove the tool, leaving the star nut permanently in place in your steerer tube. It works really, really well. If you don't have one of these, now one solution you can use if you don't have one is to use a regular M5 bolt to get the nut in place. And then once it's in place, if you put an old stem on top of your steerer tube, clamp it in place until you've got the right amount of space at the top there. This is with the bolt removed. Put your top cap on and then put the bolt in and screw it in. Just a few threads in and then use that then as a guide to hammer it into place, and hopefully that should be nice and straight for you. Not the best practice, you can't beat the correct tool for the job, but it will get it done. Now when you hit these in, make sure your fork is on something soft. I've got mine balanced on my workshop stool, so I know that the lowers of the fork are not going to get damaged. I'm just going to hold this top part here, give this a couple of hits to get it to take into place there. And I'm just going to show you up close here. As you can see here, the tool starts to lower it in. So I'm just going to strike it a few more times and it will sit flush with this outer part of the tool. Now, if you don't have a split crown race like this, you're going to need to find a tool basically to seat this correctly onto the actual steerer tube. Now, I've seen people doing this before using a punch and a mallet, but it's really not a good idea. If you had to do it that way at all, a piece of wood or something soft is a better thing because it's the bearing surface. Yeah, you don't want to distort that bearing surface in any way. Now the correct tool is something like this. This is a crown race setting tool, and essentially you have a bunch of adapters that sit over your crown race, and the whole tool would go over the top and you'd strike it with a mallet, which would seat it correctly in place. Now these used to be commonplace in bike shops, but becoming less and less used because of split crown races. But if you do have to install one, just use something that's non-damaging. We've had lots of people using PVC tube. It's plastic tube. It can't score or mark your crown race. The crown race really does have to be in perfect condition. So just take care if you're going to use something that's not the correct tool. Okay, so now it's time to reassemble the front end of the bike. So at this stage, you might choose to put some additional grease into your headset. This is actually a new bike, so it's absolutely fine, but I am going to put a bit of grease just on the crown race here, just to make sure that it keeps the water at bay. Think of grease as not just a lubricant, but as a barrier against water ingestion. So always a good thing in things like the headset that you tend to ignore from time to time. So sliding everything back in place now. Just going to make sure to get the stem spacers on nice and square, get everything adjusted, get the stem back in place. And I'm just going to put the top cap on there and just lightly do it up just to get everything in place. Then I'm going to put the bike on the floor to make sure everything gets compressed correctly before adjusting it. Okay, the last few steps now, so I'm going to get the front wheel in place so I can get that front brake dialed in. Now, if you want a video all about setting up your brakes, there's going to be a couple floating around after this one. But the rough rule of thumb with this is always get your wheel in place, and then you can use that to get your disc rotor completely centralised. Now my caliper is slightly loose here, so I'm going to pull the wheel forward slightly, putting a brake on. It'll hold the caliper in place. Now I can just nip up the bolts, see if it rubs at all, and make any finer adjustments as needed. So hopefully it should be pretty close. Not bad. Just got to see where that rubbing is occurring. At this point here, it looks like. Perfect. Time to secure all of the bolts. Now this is when I do recommend using a torque wrench. If you don't have one, then just be careful. You kind of use your intuition a bit there. You want to make sure everything is secure and safe and everything's working as it should be on your bike. Safety items, after all. Okay, so now I'm going to get the bike out of the work stand, get the cockpit completely straight, make sure my stem is in line with the wheel. Then I'm going to torque up those stem cap bolts, and then we're nearly ready to ride. Then it's a case of getting your suspension fork set up for use. Again, there's going to be another video all about that in the link underneath this one. Now everyone has their own method for getting the stem in line with the front wheel. I've always found looking at the bike from the front with the wheel directly in line with the head tube means I can line up the stem. It works good for me and that feels right. So I'm just going to adjust the top there until there's no sort of movement or play. Everything moves nice and freely and I'm sure that that's in line. If you're unsure, take your time. By all means, do it from the bike side. Now, I would definitely recommend using a torque wrench if you can. They do make a difference, especially on lightweight components like this stem here. So it's going to nip up both sides before fully tightening it. And as you'll hear with the torque wrench, it will limit how tight I can do it. In this case, it's 5 Newton meters. So there we go, so that's 5 Newton meters. There we go. So that is my front end of the bike, nice and stiff. Got the new fork on there, everything's trimmed down. Got my headset nice and adjusted. And other than doing some tweaking to the fork, the bike is ready to ride. There we go, one mountain bike with a new suspension fork on it. Hopefully that made sense to you. I can't say this enough, measure twice, cut once is super important to not mess things up. And if in doubt, leave a bit more steerer tube on there. You can always trim more off later. Don't feel like you're in a hurry to trim it down to the optimum height. I lucked out here because I knew the exact length I wanted it at. You might not, so just take your time. If you've got any comments, as always, leave them in the comment section under this video. If you've got any ideas for more maintenance related videos, hit us up in those comments. See you in the next one.